Welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is talking about some research done by SARC called Treasured Lives. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today. It's a great honour to live and work on our beautiful island of Lutruwita, and I really want to pay my respects to the traditional owners and their elders past, present and emerging. My name's Adrienne Picone and I'm the CEO of TasCOSS, and we've got a great session planned for you this morning. We've got such a wide spectrum of people attending, quite a few people in Tasmania, but also people outside Tasmania, so on the mainland, and also a couple of people joining us internationally. So welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to have you all here and to engage in this really important discussion that has such wide implications. So I'm going to start by just giving you a bit of an overview of the webinar, and then talk a bit about how the session will work, and then I'll introduce our panellists that are joining us here this morning. We've got 3 panellists here in the room, and we've got one also joining us online. So this morning's webinar, what we'll be doing is exploring some of the findings and the recommendations from the first report from Anglecare's Treasured Lives project. And this project is about exploring how to enable independent living for older Tasmanians that are living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home. And it's the first report, and it's focused on the experiences and the needs of families and carers. And this is what we'll be focusing on here this morning. To guide us through, we have a fantastic panel who have been involved in the project. So introducing you to our first panellist, and that is Lindsey Fidler, who's a social researcher, social action and research centre at Anglecare, so SARC, and Lindsey is also the author of the report. We also have Siobhan Marriott, and Siobhan is a family research participant in Treasured Lives, and she's also an artist. We have Maxine Griffiths, who's the CEO of the Mental Health Family and Friends, and Christine Materia, who's joining us virtually, and she's the Executive Policy Officer at Carers Tasmania. So welcome to our panel. So just some logistics, so you know some how this is going to work this morning. I guess one of the things that we really would like to encourage is your participation. So encouraging you to ask questions and provide feedback, so we can that will really support the findings and the project. There'll be some presentations from Lindsey. She'll take us through some of the research findings. And then there'll be 2 sessions where we'll talk about the issues raised during the research, and that's when we'll engage our panellists. And during the discussion sessions, we really would like to encourage you to ask questions or to engage in those discussions. And the way that we'll encourage you to do that is for you to raise questions or comments in the chat function. And then Ellen will actually feed those questions to the panel, and we'll engage in the discussion. Lindsey will then facilitate the final session. We'll ask you about challenges and what you need to support older Tasmanians living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home. And for that, we'll invite you to use the raise hand function, and Lindsey will then invite you to comment. So just I guess some caution or some thoughts, and that's around keeping everybody safe. As we flagged during the registration process, some of the issues that could be raised this morning could be triggering for some people. And I really guess we want to encourage you to prioritise your own self-care. If you're feeling distressed, please feel free to remove yourself from the webinar for a short period of time, or rejoin us if you feel able to. And you don't need to explain to us why you're leaving, but I guess what we want to make sure is that you can access any support that you need in this situation. And we have put in the chat function any supports and a reminder about the supports that are available if you need to utilise them. I'd now like to hand over to Lindsey Fidler, who is going to be doing a presentation and talking about some of the findings. Thanks, Lindsey.
Thank you, Adrienne, and welcome to all participants. It's great to see such interest in this important issue. I'm Lindsey Fidler, and as you said, I'm the lead researcher for Treasured Lives, and it's been an absolute privilege to work with families to explore some of the experiences and challenges and needs they have in what can be quite a private experience. So I did want to start by I want to start the webinar really by unpacking what hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home are, so that we can all sort of share that understanding before we start the discussion. So Bridget, I wonder whether we could just swap to the slides now, and I'm just going to take you through a few key issues. Thank you, Bridget. Next slide, please. Just to start with, just to say that people living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home and their families are more often judged than understood, and the visibility of their condition often defines them in the community and promotes responses of self-criticism, shame, and social withdrawal. And such stigma and stereotyping can lead to families further retreating from communities in which they live, and it tends to result in low help seeking. So shaping any appropriate support responses for older Tasmanians who are living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home and their families and carers demands that we understand the nature of the challenges, their root causes, and their personal, social and environmental impacts. It also requires a shared understanding of when it's appropriate to offer support or intervene in such private matters as how a person chooses to live. So let's just look firstly at hoarding. Bridget, next slide, please. So hoarding is a recognised mental health disorder under DSM-5, and it's described as challenges with acquiring, sourcing or discarding items or animals. The emphasis very much being on the challenges with sorting or discarding of late. And that behaviour, those challenges may lead to a cluttered living environment, impeded functioning in living spaces, so being able to use rooms for their intended purposes, and impacting on a person's health and safety. Next slide, please. An important element of hoarding disorder is that the person sees meaning or emotional attachment in items that others perhaps wouldn't regard as valuable, and that this attachment leads to significant emotional struggles in thinking about or actually discarding items. There may be a family history of acquiring or challenges with sourcing and discarding, and there's usually fixed ideas about not wasting objects. So there's some of the common characteristics that you may see with people who are exhibiting hoarding behaviour. But accompanying these beliefs and attachment are often challenges with processing information and emotional dysregulation that may be related to this disorder or may be comorbid with other mental health conditions that a person experiences. Next slide, please. Bridget, thank you. So there are common comorbidities that someone living with hoarding disorder may experience. This is not always the case, I should stress, but it is often the case. So there is often a history of trauma for the person who is living with with hoarding. It could be a childhood trauma, it could be the loss of a child, the breakup of a relationship, but there's usually some sort of critical incident or trauma that may trigger or exacerbate behaviour. And there's usually comorbid mental ill health, particularly anxiety and depression for adults, and often issues with executive functioning such as working memory, inhibition and set shifting, especially for those with later life hoarding. And amongst older people with hoarding disorder, there's often impairment due to vascular dementia and some physical capacity issues such as arthritis. So the challenges with acquiring, sorting and discarding items often accumulate with age, and the visible clutter will often accumulate too. So it's one of the two disorders that the DSM talks about as accumulating with age. Next slide, please, Bridget. So it's really important to understand the stories of individuals around their hoarding. As I said earlier, you know, it's often easy to see the visible clutter, but actually what's really important is understanding how has this developed for this particular person, and what's the meaning of the items that they choose to surround themselves with. What's their relationship to their collection that they surround themselves with? And it's also critical, of course, to interrogate your own relationship with this person. Next 2 slides, please, Bridget. One more on. Because as one of the research participants highlighted to me, you know, what may seem like a piece of paper to you might be a note from their dead husband or their child, the phone number of a friend that they've lost, and you can't just walk in and take over. So, you know, as I said to begin with, it's not our business to intervene in how people choose to live. And moving items or discarding items without the consent of people is certainly not appropriate, and is certainly likely to lead to distress for people if that's the case. But for families and carers, there may have been years of fraught conversations about health and safety issues, health and safety concerns about, for their loved ones in the living environment. They might be navigating the stigma on behalf of their loved ones, so and what they might want to see is change in order to support the health and safety concerns that they see, and that can often lead to very fraught relationships, as we'll discuss later. So one of the key things in the work that I've been doing and that families and carers have communicated to me is the importance of seeing the individual, seeing the person, understanding their relationship to their living environment, and focusing on that person, their well-being and their health and safety. So that's some of the issues that we'll talk about as we go through here. Next slide, please. Bridget. Challenges maintaining a healthy home. Now, this is what you might understand commonly to be described as squalor. We're not using that term in this project, as it's deemed as a fairly offensive term by many with lived experience. But what we're actually describing here is an environment, an unsanitary environment. So the accumulation of rubbish, decomposing food, excessive grime, dust or mould that may lead to considerable health and safety issues, or rooms not being able to use for their intended purpose. Just to flick to the next one. Challenges maintaining a healthy home is separate to hoarding, and it's important to understand that differentiation is often something that is present for older adults due to vascular dementia, or it could be due to a relationship with alcohol or drugs, or due to executive function issues like memory loss or disordered thinking. But it may be different reasons that this is present than hoarding. So again, it's important to understand what's happening for an individual. Next slide, please. And also that to understand that many people living with challenges maintaining a healthy home do not live with hoarding, and a fair percentage of those living with challenges maintaining a home, but some do basically, but there's also others who are living with hoarding who are not living with challenges maintaining a healthy home, or those challenges may develop due to the accumulation of items rather than it being an issue in itself. So just to make that distinction, that these are not, they do not necessarily go together. They are separate challenges to understand and to think about, and it's important to understand for a particular individual what's happening there. Next slide. Why is this important in Tasmania? There was a study, there was a survey done a few years ago by a collection of Tasmanian support services that found that 80% of those particular support services were working with at least one client who had challenges maintaining a healthy home or living with hoarding. Next slide, please. And the slide after that, please. And the slide after that, please. I'm just going to go on to that one. So we've got an ageing population in Tasmania, so we don't know the prevalence, but we don't know the prevalence of hoarding or challenges maintaining a healthy home, but it's likely to be significant here, and it's very hidden. There are no federal or state services that specifically target hoarding in a holistic manner, even though we have in the aged care, because it's consumer driven, and people living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home are less likely to seek help. It's not likely to be an issue that people ask for help under an aged care package for, and there aren't any specific services that they can draw on. In other states, that void has been filled by creating a strategic approach to this on a state level, like Victoria and New South Wales. We don't have that in Tasmania. So what it means here is that we have no state lead to look at what does need to happen in this space. We have no way of understanding the prevalence or consumer challenges, no collaborative infrastructure, very little supports to develop a skilled workforce for families and carers or for those living with hoarding, and no practice framework. So next slide. And the other thing to say is that stigma and building trust is a very important area in this space. So existing literature and our families and carers in our research frequently mention the crucial role that stigma plays in promoting wellness and re-ablement for those living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home. It amplifies the shame for families and carers and for those they care for. It minimises help seeking, it entrenches conflict amongst those living with challenges, their families and the communities they live in. So addressing perceptions and judgments within the community and within service industries will go a long way to initiating a path to build respect, wellness and re-ablement. So addressing stigma and building trust, which starts with understanding the conditions really and understanding the challenges, is the foundation stone, we feel, here in Tasmania to start building what are the supports that are needed, both for families and carers and for those they're caring for. I'm going to finish now. Hand back to Adrienne.
Thank you, Lindsey, and thank you so much for that overview and some of the kind of the key findings of the research. And now I guess what that does is gives us a really good springboard to move into our panel discussion, which is talking about stigma and stereotypes. And I think, you know, one of the things you talked about at the end there was just about how the stigma really amplifies the shame and minimises help seeking is what I really picked up. And I think it's really important for us to be addressing this issue and actually hearing from people who have both expertise but also lived experience in the space. So I'm going to throw it open to our panel, and what I'll do is ask each panel member in turn just to, first of all, to start off by giving a response to Lindsey's presentation. And if I could start with you, Christine.
Eddie, I just really want to know.
We're having a bit of trouble hearing you, Christine. You're still on mute.
Oh, are you? No, I'm not on mute.
Okay, great. Yeah, if you could respond to Lindsey's presentation, thanks.
Yeah, firstly, I want to congratulate Lindsey on the amazing job that she and her team have done, you know, delving into hoarding and the challenges of maintaining a healthy home. You know, in so many of the situations that we face with Carers Tasmania and Care, one of the big things that we're constantly dealing with is this stigma, and it cuts across all areas of care. And I think it's really wonderful that, again, that's being highlighted, and that need to reduce the stigma around a lot of different issues that carers in particular have in the mental health space, particularly in alcohol and drugs. Carers Tas really has just contributed to the project by actually getting some survey participants, and Care to Serve, our other arm, is the arm of the organisation that's more involved with delivering services and supports to carers who may be supporting somebody living with challenges, maintaining a healthy home or hoarding. That's probably all, Eddie, I've got to add. Just, you know, a really big congratulations that this is actually out there, it's in the community, it's being acknowledged, and that it's another thing that we need to work to get together to highlight, to reduce stigma and actually support carers and the people that they're caring for who are living with hoarding and these challenges. Yeah.
Thanks, Christine.
Thank you.
If I could move to you now, Maxine.
Thank you, and thank you, Lindsey. We live in a stigmatising society where we're all busy trying to respond to the perfect way of living, and I think that makes it really hard for families and friends to actually put their hand up and say, I think I need some support here, because we're trying to be in this perfect way of life. And one of the things that comes to my mind when we are listening and supporting families and friends in this space is that we need to be creating safe spaces for people to put their hand up and say, I think I might need to talk about something. Because this kind of condition is not a sudden onset, it's actually something that happens over a very long time. And sometimes families and friends are not quite sure, is this a problem or isn't it? Should I be seeking some education or some support around this? So I guess to be able to create safe spaces for people to realise that there may be an issue, I think is one of the very important things that we can consider setting up for people.
Great, thanks, Maxine. And just before I move on to Siobhan, just a reminder that this is an opportunity for you to ask questions of our panel as well. So if you have a question, if you put that into the chat function, then Ellen will ask that to the group and we'll be able to respond. So Siobhan, if I can move on to you of a response to Lindsey's presentation.
So I feel that Lindsey's work has just been groundbreaking. nationally, I think. As someone who has hoarding behaviours myself and who has family members who have hoarding behaviours, I've tried to participate in any study that I've seen, because I was just like, take my data, you know, to listen to the issues and try and, you know, give us solutions. And they would always, because I have multiple people in my family with hoarding behaviours, they would make me choose which person I was speaking to, either the person who has no insight into their hoarding behaviours or the person who does have insight and has accessed some of the so the Buried in Treasures program, for example, which is excellent, but which is not currently available in Tasmania. And they couldn't, you know, manage the scope of what happens when there's multiple people living in the same home or in the same family. And if you all have hoarding behaviours, are you identifying that it's a problem? And Lindsey's research just totally opened all of that up. She was able to listen to all of my different perspectives on all of those overlapping interrelations and how important that's going to be building supports that actually have that built into the foundation. So I think it's really just groundbreaking. It's very, very exciting and wonderful that, as probably possibly disappointing or desperate as it is that Tasmania doesn't have anything at the moment, what you're building is built really fantastically from the beginning.
And it sounds like the first step of that is about telling stories and actually getting this out to the open.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess so we talked about a little bit about how well this is understood by services, but it sounds like what we're saying is that there's a real lack of information and resources and support available for services themselves to be able to support people with these lived experiences.
Well, I feel like probably a lot of the public perception is built on stereotypes. So it's it may be 20 years ago no one knew what hoarding was, but then you had reality shows come in like Hoarders or Buried Alive, and then the society starts to feel that they're informed, but what they're informed by is actually stereotypes and stigma. You know, there's stigmatizing fonts that are, you know, advertising the show, and then there's soundtracks that are like, you know, sort of very scary horror type soundtracks, very stigmatizing framing, and not really compassionate. And that unfortunately tends to frame the social understanding, and then makes people less likely to access what amount of support there might be.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you about that, just in the context of some of those shows, because they're quite sort of popular at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think what you're saying is that actually those kinds of programs push people away from actually seeking help.
Lindsey said to me the other day, there's a curiosity in society about hoarding, but we have to ask, where does that curiosity stem from? And is it necessarily a sense of care? Because obviously if we are caring for people with hoarding disorder, we're still there because we love them deeply and we feel a relationship with them. And it's, you know, I'm not sure that the separation of those shows are really coming from a place of care. So it's just trying to root back into actual lived experience and care.
Yeah. That's it. I mean, I think it's understanding what care looks like for people living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home. I think and to do that, because it's not about going in and sorting out the house, you know, it's about seeing the person and what needs they have and meeting those needs. So, you know, the goals, you know, because we might have those stereotypes about what a house should look like and how someone's living environment has got to where it's got to. There may be a desire to change that living environment to sort of meet those stereotypes, whereas actually this is about what does a person need who might be living in a cluttered environment. They don't need someone to come and sort their house out, but they may need care in their lives. They need to have connection and they need, you know, and there may be a need for concerns about health and safety if it's appropriate. So the goals, it's about establishing what are the goals that are appropriate for that individual, and families and carers are at the centre of that. As you said, Maxine, it's, you know, recognising whether there is an issue or not to be concerned about. But what there'll probably always be is a desire for connection You know, how do we keep that connection going in a way that shows that care relationship?
And listening to families and friends and carers, it's what comes through for me is families and carers and friends have a relationship with that individual, and they do have a great deal of understanding about what's behind the behaviour. And so we need to be listening to families and friends and carers and listening to the story of who's actually in charge here. Who is this person? And sometimes it's the family, friend or carer, the only ones that can actually relay that story. And so the more we can, as I mentioned, the more we can create some space for the storytelling of families and friends, the more we'll get to understand what's behind this behaviour in the life of this person who might be demonstrating some hoarding behaviour.
It's about putting in context.
Yeah.
Christine, I think you had your hand up. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. I have. I've sort of been up and down, up and down. A number of things have been raised for me, and one is really interesting is this whole notion of how people living with hoarding disorders are depicted in the media. Now, I'm not actually aware of these television programs, but I could just imagine what they're like. And I sort of go back to when I was a child and there was the weird old witchy lady up the road who was a hoarder and everybody was frightened of her, and just this stigma that was associated with, and that we, when we do depict people with mental health issues or other issues within the media, we tend to depict that dark side and that scary side, which is really counterproductive to actually working with these people on their journey to wherever that may be. And breaking down the stigma. And then I think the other thing that's really important to recognise from a carer's perspective is actually acknowledging the importance of the carer. And we always seem to go back to this need for carer recognition. So carers can actually walk alongside the person and support them in understanding, communicating and healing or moving towards positive outcomes without, sort of trying to take away from them what they actually need to keep them safe in that space. So that's just, a little thought.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Christine. And Siobhan would like to add something to that.
I think also one of the things that is stigmatizing is that there is a physical clutter, and there is sometimes in terms of, and this is so important, this shift from the term of squalor to maintaining a healthy home. I think there's something really profound about shifting that, because you can have someone who actually is not doing their laundry, not doing their washing up, having food, having maybe toileting issues or bathroom issues in the home, and that is where the issues maintaining a healthy home is coming from. And then if you went into a home that was just a hoarded space and didn't have that, you might tick it off the list of not having squalor, but they may have chronic dust issues, they may have mold, that is creating other health issues in itself. So it creates an umbrella to look at it in a much broader way that it brings a lot more experiences in. But in each of those examples, you have what the person who is coming into that space might have is a disgust response. And that seems to be what society is latching onto, and that's part of where the stigmatizing comes from. But there are lots of health issues that are a little bit yucky. Like, I look after my children and I change their nappies. It's not a fun experience, but I do it as part of the care for them. And then I don't go and label my children as disgusting because I had to change their poopy nappy. Or if a nurse or a doctor is doing surgery, they have to overcome what might be a blood phobia or something in order to care for that person properly. And for some reason, all bets are off when it comes to hoarding. It's just like, oh, you have a physical or a mental illness, and we're allowed to label that as gross and yucky, and I'm allowed to put my physical response to it first, as opposed to saying I would probably have a disgust response or a visceral response to lots of different physical manifestations of physical or mental illness, and I'm not going to put that front and center. I'm going to put that back in order to care for this person. So there's a lot of different issues there that I just feel like we allow our disgust response to lead with hoarding for some reason.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Did you want to add to that?
No, I think that's.
I think we've got a couple of questions from our audience. So, Ellen, would you like to read out one of our questions, please?
We don't actually have a question, but a similar comment along the lines of what Siobhan was talking about from Marie, who had sadly heard a Housing Tasmania employee describe tenants as squalor, and that same look of disgust on their face. And she was saying she hopes Housing Tasmania can educate their workers to show some more respect for people with challenging issues. It's a similar thoughts there.
Just to respond to that, Marie, was it? Who did have that comment? Yeah, Marie, you might be interested to know that Housing Tasmania has recognised the problem of tenancy officers going in and doing conditions of property assessments and putting their own standards on those assessments. So they have recently introduced a clutter image rating as part of their condition of property assessment. So if they're going into a home where there may be hoarding present or challenges maintaining a healthy home, they're now starting to use an assessment, a visual assessment of the severity of that, and that tenant will be referred to a specialist tenancy support worker who can work with that individual on addressing some of the concerns that Housing Tasmania have. Now, I think they're still in the process of training tenancy officers around that, but it's a really I think it's a really welcome addition to housing support work on behalf of Housing Tasmania. And I know that they're now working with the social housing providers in Tasmania to roll that out. So I think we're early days with it. So you may not have experienced that with whether it's a family member or a client that you might be working with, but that should start to wash through the practice of Housing Tasmania over the next year or so.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I guess we heard from Lindsay about the lack of support or lack of service, understanding and services available to support people living with hoarding. And I guess one of the things I just wanted to check in about is about how the stereotypes and stigma impact on help seeking amongst those living with hoarding for you as families and carers within this.
Thank you. I just made some notes around the term disgust and our disgust response. And from listening to families and friends and carers, there's a transference of that disgust to families and friends as well. And sometimes people in our communities might say something to a family member of, you know, surely you can go and sort it out. You're her son or you're her daughter, and then that family member is left with this sense of, oh, they're disgusted with me, and it's my fault, and they're expecting me to go and sort this out. Whereas we're actually asking family members to take the full responsibility of ensuring that this is no longer an issue. And I think we need to, as a community, look at a collective sense of responsibility, that this is a community issue that we need to work on together, and trying to ease the burden of responsibility from families and friends, because it is a huge responsibility. Often families and friends don't have the educational knowledge about what's happening, what to do, how to respond. And yet as a society, we expect families and friends to go and fix the problem. So I'm calling for who is actually responsible for ensuring that we as helpers, we as people who care, have the education and knowledge and skills to understand how to best support the person. And I'm looking for that responsible being to help families and friends to move forward.
It's a really good point, because we recognise it as a mental health disorder. We wouldn't expect in other mental health disorders for families to fix it. We'd be actually accessing services and support, and then pulling in the support of family and friends to support that. Would you like to add anything to that, Siobhan?
Sure. I think one of the things I try to do with my work, I do book reviews, and I try to share hoarding resources and look at different representations of hoarding. And another one of the sections of book reviews I do is looking at home care books and decluttering books, like conventional, normal, in inverted commas, decluttering books, and how they're actually debunking how they're actually unhelpful. It's like, I don't know, it's almost like people with hoarding behaviours have a horse and cart, and someone with a car is like, well, you just put oil in it and that's how you look after your, you know, moving vehicle. And it's not the same thing. You can't just bring regular housekeeping skills to a hoarded environment and expect that to work, and it can actually be stymieing or shaming or debilitating if you can't. Then you feel like a failure. They've given you the Marie Kondo book and you don't have a lounge room space in which to put all of your things to sort them out, and you can't even do the first step of the decluttering book. So that can be more damaging too. So it's trying to find actually use resources that are actually specifically for hoarding behaviours and using those, and not putting extra pressure on people. And I know people are trying to do their best and they're trying to help, but that often doesn't actually help.
Yeah, in terms of lack of understanding.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yes. Christine, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I did. I'm sort of picking up in the discussion that we're really focusing on the hoarding rather than the individual and the individual's need for health and wellbeing services to improve their mental health. And then, you know, like we seem to, and I might be wrong because I'm not actually in the room, it's, you know, difficult, but you know, we're talking about you know, Siobhan's just talked about books and different ways of improving the living space, but we need to actually step deeper into it and say these are individuals that have trauma. From what Lindsey said, you know, the basis of these hoarding disorders and is based in trauma. So what are we actually doing to support that, and really going to the depths of it, which is the most difficult place to go, because then we're back in that space of under-resourcing and lack of services and supports. And I don't know, it's just a thought to throw out to participants.
Would you like to respond to that?
One of the things that is really difficult, I think, is also generational when we're talking about older people living with hoarding behaviours, because at least in my experience, getting some of those people to talk about their feelings and their trauma is nigh on impossible. So that's definitely another layer of it. Is how do you, it's one thing to get them to accept care in the home, which they may refuse, but to then try and get to that deeper level that you're talking about is not so straightforward either.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, I mean, I'll come on to this after the break, but I mean, it's clear that any care and support for families and for those living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home needs to be long-term and needs to adapt to wherever the family's at, really. And it is really important, Christine, as you say, that at least what's available can provide a holistic package of support. So that does mean you do need the clinical support to take care of any mental health concerns or illnesses, both for those living with hoarding and sometimes for the family as well, when it's led to long-term stress and anxiety related to care. So the clinical supports need to be there. Those psychosocial supports need to be there to ensure that families and people living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home are that their health and well-being is stressed. So, you know, and that can be about connection. So for families, that really needs to be about recognizing that they're not doing this alone. One of the real what was really clear when I was doing the research is that this can be quite a lonely journey for families and carers. They usually don't know anybody else who is experiencing similar challenges, and they're facing this alone. There were many who spoke to me where it was the first time they'd spoken to anybody about this in any depth. So having that ability to connect for families is really important through things like peer support networks. And also ability to connect for those living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home if they desire it, you know, or when they desire it. And then you need the practical supports as well, and that might be, you know, some light maintenance of the living environment to ensure it's healthy or safe for a person living there, or supports to help families and carers do that, because again, often it's the families and carers who are doing most of the practical supports, you know, the running around, the creating safe routes through the house, the making sure there's somewhere to sleep, somewhere to cook. So it's about having that holistic those holistic supports available when and where when they're needed by the family. But it's got to be long term, and it's got to be adaptable. So I mean, I'll come on to what we've actually recommended in the next half of the webinar. But yes, and the problem for services is clearly that this is a very niche area of support, and they're often coming at this through one little bit of the scope, whether it's, you know, they're doing aged care packages and they're able to provide some light domestic support, whether they're a mental health provider who is doing some community-based psychosocial supports, whether it's an organisation that's concerned with animal welfare and is responding to a concern about animals on the property. Whatever it is, it's usually one element of that support that they're responding to. And there's no way at the moment, in Tasmania at least, for them to join up with the collection of services that are needed to reach out to the family or to directly support the person who's having the challenges. So I'll give you an idea about what that could look like here in the second half of this webinar. But yes, it does need to focus on the individual, Christine, completely. It needs to recognise the individual's health and well-being and that of the family and carers at the centre. Yeah,
that's great.
And I might just add, I think it's a word of caution when we're thinking about the creation of a new set of services, perhaps, and that we have to be careful that we don't create silos. And what I mean by that is that when we're thinking about how we might support families and carers, we need to be careful that we don't set families and carers up to expect that that what they need is a specialist support service, whereas just peer-to-peer support is as specialised as you need. You don't necessarily need to have a highly specialised facilitated support mechanism for families and friends. It can be as simple as creating spaces where families and friends come together and allow them to create what is needed for them. So I guess I just wanted to go, well, let's make this simple. Let's not create a service map here that we won't be able to maintain or afford. Let's look at what families and friends might suggest for themselves that they might need, and we might be surprised at how simple it might be.
Great. It's a really nice way to wrap up this session. You talked about it being a niche area, Lindsay, and obviously we've talked also about it being hidden and stigmatised, but really why it's so important for us to be having this conversation, and the research is also so critical for us here in Tasmania. So we're actually going to close this session with a poll, an online poll, which Bridget will put up soon. And it's what we're asking you to do is to rate your knowledge about hoarding before the webinar, and now to rate whether this session has changed your knowledge and your understanding of hoarding. So we'll give you a minute to do that. And then what we'll actually do is take a 5-minute comfort break. And we'll rejoin at 11 o'clock. Thanks, everyone. So Bridget will put the poll up now to get you to respond to that.
Screen. Listen to the
Welcome back, everybody. It's good to have a bit of a break and then come back into our session on treasured lights. Just at the end of that session, there are a couple of people who put some questions up in the chat function. So I'm just going to ask Lindsay, I'll hand over to Lindsay for a few minutes just to address those questions.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. There's a comment here from Jane Chapman. So Jane, you're saying, can a support web chat group page be created with the structure of different services from someone living with hoarding traumas, and a group where people can chat to like-minded people and form connections to start the real step of digging deep into what the trigger and dealing with that. So Jane, I'm taking that to be about services, so being in a chat, in a web chat. Is that?
Do you want to take yourself off mute, Jane and just clarify that question?
Have a chat with us about that.
Hard to find the mute button sometimes.
It is. Whilst and Kate, you may still be, you may not be back yet. So I'll just say that one of the things that is important for support for families and for those living with hoarding or challenges maintaining a home is having some way of bringing services together to support that person, whether it's a virtual group that brings together all those services, or whether it's a regular sit down in a region of all the mental health, housing, aged care, disability support, animal welfare, emergency services, local government supports together to actually go through a case and understand what's needed for that individual. Yes, that does need to happen. It's one of the recommendations, actually. So there are there is a desire, certainly in the south at the moment, for that group to be established. And that, hopefully we can try and set up something similar in the north and northwest. It's baby steps at the moment, and through the second part of the research that I'm doing, I am working with services to look up how that might work how that could be facilitated. So watch this space on that, really, Jane. I think. And a comment from IPO TV, I think. Forgive me if. Oh no, it's not. I've just got IPO TV. IPO Fin. Sorry, that pronunciation was terrible. Your comment is around the difficulty of home care packages to support consumers under consumer-directed care because of the perhaps the lack of recognition of the issues, and that family aren't around. Yes, consumer-directed care, it is really tricky, but I think this is partly about honouring consumer-directed care as that. So aged care packages do need to be consumer-directed. If knowing when to intervene is a real issue, we know, and that's why it's important that there's a common and a shared understanding of the points at which it's appropriate to intervene. Again, other states have that sort of shared practice framework, so it's clear when it becomes a health or safety issue, rather than having it as a subjective assessment of when to intervene. Again, that's something that we need here in Tasmania, and it's important then for any support that comes in on the basis of that that it's not consumer directed, that it's additional support that can sit with any consumer directed package. Again, I'll explore a bit more of that in this second half, and also the second half of the research that I'm doing at the moment is looking at those sorts of issues. I think that's all. We'll perhaps cover the other issues when we come to the.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lindsay. And so just so this next part of this morning's webinar will be similar to the last session, in that we will start off with a presentation from Lindsay, and then we'll move into the panel discussion. And then at the end, Lindsay will actually pose some questions for all of you, for participants. So we'll engage in a discussion, and you'll have an opportunity then to provide any kind of feedback or thoughts as part of that discussion. So I'd just now like to hand over to Lindsay, who's going to be talking about families and carers' experiences, particularly around the roles and the impacts, and also around conversations on ageing. So I'd like to hand over to you now, Lindsay.
Thank you. I'm just going to put a shout out to our tech support.
Yes.
I seem to have I've minimised our view. So we might need a bit of in-room support to get our view back on the screen. But whilst we do that, I will just take us through a little bit around the Treasured Lives project itself and what we found about the experiences of carers and families supporting older people who are living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home, and also some of the what works elsewhere in this support and what we've recommended as part of the research. So Bridget, could we go on to the Treasured Lives Goals screen, please? I can't.
So we need to speak.
Oh, hang on. I might have done it.
Moment.
Right. Whilst we're waiting for the presentation, I'll just talk through what we're doing with Treasured Lives. So as Adrienne said, we're through the Treasured Lives project, we're examining how to support older Tasmanians to age independently if they're living with challenges related to hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home. And we're doing that through trying to understand the experiences and needs of families and carers, of services who are working with families and carers and older Tasmanians, and also understanding the experiences of older Tasmanians who are living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home. I'm also examining I'm exploring what the current service landscape looks like in Tasmania to support that, but also I'm looking at what's happening in other Australian jurisdictions and internationally to inform what recommendations need to could work here. And we're doing this in 2 phases. So the first phase specifically looked at families and carers, as Adrienne's explained. And then there's a second phase that I've just started now, which is working with service providers and also working with older Tasmanians. So there'll be a second report that comes out at the end of December that really shapes what that what the services should look like in the eyes of older Tasmanians themselves. Next, we go on to the slide that says families and carers, gateways to trust and support, please. It's 3 slides on, I think. To do this research, I worked with 25 families and carers. As I said, felt very privileged to work with them, who shared their experiences either through interview or through survey. And as I said, what really struck me about their experiences was just how amazing their understanding of what was happening was, and what a private experience, and often quite a lonely experience they were having in supporting their loved ones around this. And that was really driven by the stigma that we talked about earlier. But what was really clear to me is that families and carers, where they're present, and as one of the participants said, that's not always the case. We do understand that, and we will cover that in the second half of the study. But for where families and carers are present, they are certainly the gateways to trust and support for the person they care for. And that's because they have three really important roles and experiences. One is relational, so they are often the window on the world for the person that they're caring for. They may be one of the only few visitors to the home. They are often navigating the stigma within the family and so with community, and also sometimes within the family as well. So there can be quite fractious relationships within a family around relationships with those living with hoarding. So the families that I spoke to were often, they were at the centre of that, really. They were navigating the world for their loved ones and also for themselves and within their family. They shared excellent insights into the health and history of those they cared for. We will share these slides with you, and I've included some stories, because I think, as we said, the stories are really important to understand what's happening for individuals and in order to provide care and support. The families I spoke to could share excellent stories about the development of behaviour and living environments, the core reasons or the triggers that they felt may have led to behaviour being exacerbated, the boundaries that the boundaries of behaviour and support that worked for them and the person they cared for in their relationship. So what to talk about, what not to talk about, what to navigate within the environment and what not to navigate within the environment. You know, they had years of experience of this. And were key, and one of the important roles that most families talked to me about was the need to maintain trust with the person that they were caring for, and privacy, that they were key elements. Keeping that relationship healthy and thriving was really important, and that meant understanding the terms of that relationship. So trust and privacy were talked about by everybody I spoke to, really, as the key to keeping a relationship going And that relationship wasn't always on good terms, but maintaining it through the years meant trust and privacy. They were often lone carers who were focusing on minimising risk. So they had a practical role in the lives of those they cared for and for themselves. They often saw that their role was focused on safety first. So within the boundaries of trust and privacy that they were maintaining with the person, with their loved one, they felt that what they needed to do was focus on safety first for their loved ones. So as we talked about, that could be ensuring that there's somewhere to sleep, there's somewhere functioning to cook and to toilet, and safety routes through the house so that people can travel from those functioning spaces and exit and enter the home. And given the age group of those they cared for, there was nearly always a thought within that they needed to keep those routes open so that services could come in and out of the home when needed. So for a lot of the families that I spoke to, if they were working on changes to the living environment, it was usually around how can we make sure that services can come in when you need them as you age. So how can we make sure the hallway would enable exit and entry? How can we make sure that there's spaces in which you can be supported? But the majority of families that I spoke to were really clear that they were doing this on their own. There was nowhere for them to turn to for support. So they were doing the main share of the practical load. They were doing the main share of the emotional care and welfare checks too. So it was on them because there were no supports for them to draw on. So what that really meant for the majority of families is that they were carrying, it was a big emotional load for them. So it was really a private and a long-term load, as I put here. So they were often sandwich caring because of their age too. So often they had kids or partners or other family responsibilities. So they were often caring for whether it was parent, sibling, whoever it was, and also other members of the family. They were carrying an ongoing concern about the environmental, personal and social risks that their loved one's living environment presented for them. Particularly, I'm really worried they're going to fall as they get older and more frail. I'm worried about the trip hazards. I'm worried about fire risks. I'm worried that if an ambulance needs to get in, they're not going to be able to get into the house. These were the sorts of concerns that were expressed very, very regularly, very, very clearly. They would do anything to keep that fragile relationship going. So for some more than others, they had a very fractious relationship with the person they were caring for, but they wanted to hold on to that relationship no matter what, because they knew if they dropped that relationship, that person would probably be on their own. So that meant a lot of arguments, a lot of frustration, a lot of ongoing worry that was unresolved, a lot of feeling of hopelessness that they weren't able to support the safety of the person that they care for. But maintaining that fragile relationship was very, very important. And they rarely sought support for themselves because they weren't aware of any support for themselves, basically. So, as I said, this was often a very private experience for them. They hadn't spoken to other people about it. They weren't aware of any support services. This is in Tasmania, remember. But, we know that there are other places that have support services, but in Tasmania we don't. We're starting from almost a blank sheet. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Bridget? So I think, you know, I'm not going to go into this in much more detail, but just to say, you know, they have multiple roles and challenges that they were balancing, and it was very long term. And I know I've repeated this, but I can't express it enough. It was, as one research respondent said, this is not a quick fix. You know, you start hoarding, you stop hoarding, and all of a sudden everything's lovely and smooth. No, that's not what happens here. Normally, once they start, and I watched this progress from, we had a spare room full of junk, and then a lounge room was half full. The lounge room became completely absorbed. The roof space is completely absorbed. Mum's bedroom is now completely absorbed. It's like a disease. It's like watching a piece of mold on a fruit. Now that's quite a negative representation of this. I know Siobhan and I have had a discussion about this in particular. But I do think it illustrates the fact that often families have watched the progression of any health issues and the physical manifestation of the living environment as well. They've seen it, and it's what is the point, as you said, Maxine, what is there an issue for me to intervene here? Should I? You know, is this my business? Is this not my business? What should I do? Where should I go? Know where to go to. It's an ongoing concern for families and carers, usually unresolved. By the time someone's in old age, the idea of how are they going to live well at home becomes a real source of anxiety. We can go on to the next slide. So most of the families that I spoke to had some discussions about ageing in place. And that was the overwhelming desire of those they cared for, was to age at home. But the families and carers saw huge obstacles in that. We can go to the next slide. They could see and recognise the positive impacts of ageing in place, that it would maintain that attachment to place and items that their loved one had. It would maintain the comfort that comes with that, and the control of the living environment. All the things that would, you know, help the well-being, the emotional well-being of the person they loved. And that there's a strong recognition of that. However, we can go to the next slide. There's lots of concerns about how that would happen. So the practical concerns, how, you know, as my loved one ages and they become more frail, how they're going to function in the home, the personal risks of tripping and falling, as we talked about, the environmental risks of fire hazards, the ability of services to enter the home for support. How the other concern was around, well, how do we maintain control and dignity for our loved ones in this process? I mean, it's similar for a lot of people who are aging as well. This is not specific really to this cohort, but you know, we know it's you know, it's important, and families really recognise this, that the choices are left in the hands of their loved ones. But because they also recognise that their loved ones had low insights into the risks of their living environment, they just wanted to get to a point where they could have that discussion. How do we make this environment safe for you to age in and practical? And they also knew that most of those they cared for were wary of intervention because they didn't want their living environment to change. So they didn't particularly welcome services into the home in order to support them to age well at home. And then lastly, that they just didn't know where to turn to start those conversations, to start the sorts of supports that would enable them to support their loved one to age well at home. So they just didn't know where to turn. So the trajectory that they saw was ultimately that their loved one would not have a choice, that they would probably have to go into residential care, or critical incident would trigger a move, so they would be hospitalised and then they wouldn't be able to return because they couldn't return into a safe space, or they would die in place. And for families, then there was the dread of then having to handle the collection. So what do we do with the collection? Next slide, please. How am I doing? Couple of minutes, yeah. One thing I wanted to note, and I'm continuing this into the second half of the study, is that we know that challenges often, that people don't often set forward for help, and that challenges often remain hidden. But in conversations with families and carers, lots of them mentioned that the triggers for engagement with services or insights often came through critical incidents. So someone that their loved one was hospitalised, or there was a tenancy risk that required intervention. There was an animal welfare concern that prompted intervention, a neighbourhood complaint, or a fire risk, or a fire, I should say there. Now these interactions are all very negative interactions that have very heavy sanctions related to them, but they are opportunities, potentially, I would say, to turn they're opportunities to promote positive engagement. So one of the things I'm doing in this next section of the work is look at, if we know that these are points of intervention or points of engagement with services for older people living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home, how can we turn them into positive engagement? So what are essentially emergency or statutory services, how can we support them to engage positively and holistically with people who they encounter, rather than, you know, going and presenting what's really usually a road of sanction? So what are the immediate specialist supports that are needed, and also how can we then sort of create that as a pathway to longer term specialist supports or positive support? Just very quickly then on what works elsewhere and what we're recommending. So next slide, please. So this is a big slide. So what we know about what works elsewhere is that we need, as I mentioned before, what we know, what's been evaluated as working elsewhere is having what's called a multidisciplinary task force that brings together all the services that may have a concern or an interaction or some relevancy to those living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home and their families and carers. They're usually led by mental health services, but also crucial for these task forces are to have disability services, housing services, emergency services, local government supports, family and carer supports, adult care, anything you can think of really where there might be an interaction. And what these task forces do is they act as the organizer really of support in a particular area. So that would be, they would be the case referral point. So a case might come in, for example, through Tas Fire Service, and it might be it might be decided that the best lead for that support might be mental health services, so that might be a referral through the task force to mental health services, and then the other supports that are needed for that person would be wrapped around through that task force. They organise the workforce development needs, the training needs for a local area, but crucial to the types of supports that are needed for families and carers, which, you know, is similar really to the supports for those living with hoarding, are ensuring that we have the clinical supports in place. So medication, mental health supports, one-to-one therapeutic counselling, so that families and carers both have those for themselves and also for those living with hoarding. And that's really to recognise that there are two lots of needs here: the psychosocial supports that are needed there. So motivational interviewing, family-based training and therapy are very popular in that area. So that's really about helping families to develop the sorts of positive relationships that are needed between themselves and those they're caring for in order to provide that base of care when it's needed. So mend those rifts, or those grudges, or those arguments that have led to negative relationships within the family. Ensure that that there's a closer care network around that individuals and around the family themselves. The practical supports that are needed, so it might be, that's usually around having a harm minimisation approach to supports. So for the family and for those living with hoarding, that's about recognising what are the goals that are needed for individuals. They're usually around safety and harm minimisation. So having a way to help families work with service providers on what those goals should be, who should be involved in supporting the family and the individual to achieve those. Having the peer support networks in place that enable the family to be able to draw on others who have shared experiences, whether that's generic shared experiences, and there's also some online specialist peer support networks that are pretty good for helping families, I think, to go, has this worked? You know, what works, what training is good, what, you know, what books, you know, that sort of thing. And of course the information and advice needed for families and for those living with hoarding. So last slide. I've gone over, I know, sorry. So that has led to, for the research, we've really developed 3 areas of recommendations for this first part. The first is that there needs to be a way to address stigma, raising awareness and generate respect around hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home. So positive community education campaigns here in Tasmania. There's also a need to develop a framework of specialist policies, practice and programmes in Tasmania. So creating those regional Tasmanian task forces that would support the bringing together of those services. A shared practice framework and case management for services. So understanding when to intervene as a shared understanding, and that shared case management that we've talked about. Specialist information services for families and carers, on where they can get services themselves and for their loved ones. And then the specialist clinical, psychosocial and practical support services for those living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home that families can refer their loved ones to. And the last one, but not least, investing in a continuum of care for families and carers. So again, the specialist personal counselling that's needed for them as carers. Training programs around hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home so they can understand what's happening for their loved ones in their response. Online and face-to-face peer support networks, as we've talked about, and those family support programs that I started to talk about in the last slide that really help families to work together and focus on relationship as well as the practical supports that are needed.
Thank you, Lindsey. Yeah, no, look, that's a great overview of this section of the research, and obviously, you know, the carers and family members carry an enormous load in supporting people with hoarding behaviour, but also obviously the lack of support that's available to them, and good to get a picture of what is actually needed for that to come from lived experience. So we might just adjust the agenda slightly because we are a little bit behind time.
Sorry.
So we'll move now into the panel session, but I think we probably won't get to the end session, which was around you posing questions to participants. So I guess what I'd really like to encourage everyone to do is, if you do have any questions or you want to make any comments, now's the time to do that. So put everything you'd like to ask or need to know into the chat function. And we'll be posing those. We'll ask a few questions of our panel and then we'll ask your questions as well. So please put your questions into the chat function. If I could just start with you, Maxine, because I could see you wriggling on your seat and writing notes, so I know you're ready to go. Just to respond to some of the things that Lindsey was talking about in terms of families and carers' experiences.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a few comments. One is around the fact that some families may not be physically present in order to help with storytelling and in order to work alongside services. My view, and from listening to families, they don't have to be physically present to be able to contribute to a recovery approach to supporting the individual, and that I think that services need to invest in building their own capacity to work alongside families and consumers as a whole. I think that right across the mental health space, there is a lot going on around working alongside families, but I think we need to upskill ourselves as service providers to not believe that we're just funded to work with the consumer. We need to expand our thinking and to one where we firmly believe that we are working with the whole, and that is the informal supports around a person, and that we need to have the skills to do that. The role of families in this space is no different from our experience in the general mental health space. We're now seeing service providers and funding and commissioning for funds that include, you need to work with families and friends. You need to work with the informal supports around the person. I just want to also say, when we talk about ageing in place, sometimes families might believe that ageing in another place is better. I think that we need a whole lot of education about what that other place might look like, so that if families are involved in decision making around whether their loved one is ageing in place or in another place, that they're fully informed about the options. Because I've seen families be involved in making decisions around where their loved one might live, and if it's decided that a nursing home or a more intensive supported environment is the best, my question is the best for whom? And that we need to be really mindful about thinking about, is the grass greener over there for my mum or dad or sister? Or do we roll up our sleeves and we really get stuck into helping to make this a better place for the person to age in place?
Great, thanks, Maxine. Siobhan, can I ask you to respond to Lindsey's presentation?
I think it's just really important work that is showing how complex the issue of hoarding behaviours is, and particularly actually bringing family members and carers in to actually provide our insights as specialists, as a, from our lived experience, is just massively verifying. Like, just as Lindsey said, even sometimes it could be someone's first time talking about it and realizing you're not the only one and you're not alone. As much as Lindsey is showing how there are lots of other issues. So, for example, neurodiversity can, be one of the contributing factors to hoarding behaviours. I guess my angle that I write from is an anti-capitalist lens. So, looking at how the people are living under capitalism and messages to consume and messages to buy at the same time as trying to deal with that impulse to acquire, but while simultaneously kind of being punished if you don't have the right thing, or if you don't have a house, or if you don't, so that you can kind of see how it's rational for people to keep things if they may lose their job and then they may not have the money to buy something. So looking at that as the umbrella, and then understanding that people are at intersections of different discriminations, so they may feel shame about their hoarding and want to come forward to access help about that, but then they may feel confronted that they may experience racism or discrimination on their sexuality or gender, or they may have chronic illness or a disability that is making it difficult for them to access supports in other ways, because we don't lead single issue lives. So most likely you're not just going to interact with someone who just has hoarding disorder and that's their thing. And I understand what Christine's trying to contribute about trauma as well and interacting that in. And the only thing I would say to that, to the trauma and the actual narrative and understanding the person and the reasons, is that I've kind of got to a place where I don't feel it's okay for me to tell the trauma story, because it's not my story. So I speak to hoarding behaviours because I actually have my own hoarding behaviours, and I'm trying to address that, and like as a lifelong thing that I'm going to have to deal with that for the rest of my life. But again, living under the messages of capitalism constantly telling me I need things, but at the same time understanding that there's trauma there, but you may not get that full story. You may not be able to mine that, and you may just have to accept that the person has had an experience that they can't fully expose or talk about, or they may only talk about it in the private environment that Lindsay's discussing. So there's just kind of seems to be a lot of different layers to it to keep in mind simultaneously.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Siobhan. And Christine, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I will. I won't add a lot. Siobhan, what you've just said is really important, and for me, that's about actually recognising the level or the depth that one can go to within the hoarding disorder or the inability to maintain a healthy home, and having the carers actually working, the family and friend carers supporting them at the level that they can. And for me, I think, most importantly, it's the destigmatisation is where we need to be, and building that community of support. The family and friend carers and the broader community to actually hold these people and support them with their disorder, and actually identify the level where they can actually intervene, for want of a better word, and support them for change and improving their health and well-being and the environment in which they live.
It's a really clear message around destigmatising and also being telling the stories from all different perspectives. I guess we just had some questions around the services that we have in Tasmania, and Lindsay's talked about that when she was doing her presentation. But what sort of services, or do you think we've got the services, Christine? I'm going to go to you again, in Tasmania that families and carers need, and that might be services that support carers with self-care, or services that support them to support those living with hoarding.
At risk of saying something wrong, I think in some ways we're actually over-serviced, and the issues that we have are around resource allocation and coordination and continuity of care, and being able to move effectively and efficiently through and up this, that system in a continuum of care. So I tend to believe that, yes, we do have the services and support. We just need to be smarter about the way that we access them and the way that we support people to access them.
Yeah. And what about you, Maxine?
I would add to that, and I would say that we need to hop out of our silo way of thinking about service provision in this small state with our small population, and stop believing that we need a specialist service for everything. I think that there's room for us, for existing services, to grow in their capacity to understand, and perhaps with a little bit of extra funding, we could be providing what we're talking about. But I think in Tassie, we do have this tendency to think we need a whole new thing, where maybe if we just tweaked here and there, we might be able to get something off the ground that could really meet the needs of the people we're talking about.
We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We just need to add.
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything?
Yes, I have a family member who has accessed the Buried in Treasures program on the mainland, and that's one of my family members who has insight into their hoarding. We have another family member who has no insight, and it's not a problem. It's not an issue. Hasn't read the book, doesn't want to. But for the person who does have insight, that program is incredible. And when that individual had to interview to get selected for the program, that's the amount of demand that there was in that state. And then when I was talking with the psychologist, they mentioned that I could come to a carer support meeting simultaneously. And they said, I said, well, I'm living in Tasmania at the moment. They said, don't worry, just contact Lifeline down there and go to one of their Buried in Treasures supporters meetings. And I contacted Lifeline down here, and it's that we're not running the Buried in Treasures program at all. The Buried in Treasures program is incredible. We just need to get it out into everyone's hands. And I guess I would say, from the point of view of someone who actually has my own hoarding behaviours and, you know, with 3 children, is trying to address this so that I'm, you know, not necessarily influencing them. And I understand the range of this report is not, you know, about middle-aged people or children with hoarding behaviours, but it's how are they cycling through, and that there are people, as you're saying, in the sandwich generation who also require this support. And I would never take, if you had the Buried in Treasures program, I would never take the place of, you know, someone who more chronically needed the help. But at the same time, if I don't get that support now, I'm just on a trajectory to those kind of behaviours later. So the system on the mainland is excellent. I think implementing that, and then understanding that some of the people who may go to the carers meetings may also actually need access to a sandwich generation peer support hoarding behaviours program as well. And not understanding it, not sort of just focusing on one member of the family or something. Understanding
that's certainly been a really clear message that I've heard today. It's not just about that person, but it's about putting them into context and seeing the whole environment that's contributing. Now, I know we've got some questions from participants, so if I could just hand over to Ellen, who will ask those questions for us.
They're not really questions, there's just a lot of really good commentary worth noting. Jason Williams, he's actually left, unfortunately, but he is a social landlord who's been working with an elderly tenant for a couple of years to address her hoarding. The tenant didn't want to engage in any services, but did acknowledge there was a problem. It wasn't until serious maintenance issues arose where contractors had to gain access to get through the property. They had a tenancy support officer who witnessed this unfolding trauma and offered counselling, but again described how there was a lack of resourcing to capacity, lack of capacity to resource that support. So it was quite limited to be able to offer the help that was needed. So I guess that's a common thread of what we've been talking about. Patricia Stanwell, she's I think really enjoying the slides, has commented that totally agrees with a lot of your presentation, Lindsay, and has been, her experience with hoarding has been through responses to neighbourhood complaints, and agrees with engaging with a range of support services, which is essential to assisting the individual involved. I don't know if Patricia wants to come on and comment, but she would also say that in all of the hoarding cases she's dealt with, the individuals involved were isolated from family, which some may say triggered the hoarding behaviour. The hoarded items replaced the family contact, which may be why the individual was reluctant to let go of the items they collected. I'm not sure, Patricia, whether you wanted to unmute and have a conversation. She appeared. No?
I can certainly make some comments. I think Patricia might have left the screen for a while. So yes, I think that relationship to items is common over people, as it were, and that in itself can often cause some of the tension between family members, if there's some resentment there. So yes, that can sometimes cause the breakdown of relationships. I mean, I think that from what, in terms of the service response, I guess, around that and around some of the other scenarios we've talked about. And it is, as both Christine and Maxine said, it's that there's a lot of generic service the services that we have at the moment that can totally support families and those living with hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home. But certainly from the beginnings of my conversations I've had with those service providers, there are two issues that tend to arise. One is, because this is a niche area of their support, it's a few clients, it's not everybody. It's that as professionals, it's that they want to ensure that they understand the nature of the challenges that they need to support. So having that understanding of what hoarding and challenges maintaining a healthy home are, you know, the comorbidities, understanding their stories is important to many professionals in understanding the service response. So there's a training need, I think, amongst the workforce development training need to understand, to make sure that professionals do have that basic understanding when they are presented with clients with these challenges. And secondly, you know, it's their long-term support needs usually. So there's a lot of support services are offered in small amounts. It might be an hour support a week, it might be 2 hours support a week, and it might be for a limited amount of time. And really, this is about needing to put a base of support in place for a sustained amount of time. So the shape of services at the moment isn't necessarily fit for this purpose. And then thirdly, as Christine and Maxine have talked about, it's that coordination of supports that really needs addressing. We know that we have really good services in Tasmania, but if they can't reach out to each other to case manage and to be flexible about who's leading and who's supporting in that space, it makes everybody's life so much more difficult. So there is a lot around it in this space anyway, around having that task force or that coordinated group who can meet to actually share supports in this space. I know that, I mean, those that deal with the critical incidents, as was talked about here, whether it's a neighbourhood complaint or whether it's a tenancy issue or an animal welfare issue, that are sometimes time sensitive as well. So there needs to be a response within, you know, 6 months, or there'll be a sanction. You know, there really does need to be somewhere where they can go immediately for that support, that isn't just about the sanction, that's actually about how can we support you holistically rather than how can we support you to clear a space. Because I think that's, for me, that's a very clear message for families and carers and for those living with hoarding, is that supports in this space aren't just about the living environment. I guess back to what you were saying, Christine, earlier, is, you know, the basis of support is care, and that has to be the basis of support. Any support that's around changes to living environments needs to be as and when needed and as appropriate, but not the consistent focus. So, you know, I know I'm talking in utopian language in some way about what support should look like, but it's really critical in this area, and that's what the basis of a lot of the family support programs look at, is that what's the, you know, how can we create relationship which then enables any interventions that are needed at a later date.
Can I say something to that just really quickly? When you're saying that it's utopian, I feel like it's because it is in contrast to quite a dire system of, you know, what I see as capitalism and gentrification of towns or of suburban areas, where the concern may be driven by property prices, or the concern may be driven by someone moving in and, you know, and being a landlord or something like that. And the urgency comes from the center of that, the facade, or trying to remove the chaos or the eyesore and that kind of thing, and getting the person to conform to society again from the outside, rather than, as Lindsey is showing, to center the person and the care for them. So it's like, I think it's an important contrast.
Yeah, that can happen.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking we might just have one final question for the panel, because it would be good to make some time so we can do our poll before we close. But I guess we talked a lot about the services that we have, or the lack of services that we have in Tasmania, and you mentioned about Buried Treasure. Is that
Buried in Treasures is a book. It's a workbook that you can do on your own, and I've done it through for myself.
Yeah.
And it was only through reading it twice with the idea of helping my family members that I realised that I have a lot of those behaviours myself. And it's very relatable. It's, do you have sentimental attachment? Of course, lots of people have sentimental attachment, but that also helps make it relatable when you understand that there are things that everyone experiences in their attachment with their things that's just been turned up to 11.
So the spotlight. Yeah. And we've also talked about, you talked about a task force, I think, Lindsey, and we've talked about, improving current services rather than sort of reinventing the wheel. But I guess my final question for each of you is probably around not just what services that we need, but what are our next steps? What are we going to do from here? So I guess about sort of what needs to happen to get us to a place where we actually can support people and family members and carers with these with hoarding behaviour. Would you like to start?
You're asking me. I think I got to this point in Lindsey's research where I was like, I don't have an answer, and that's almost what you started with saying, was it's expected that the families are supposed to arrive fully formed, educated with solutions for something that apparently isn't happening, and it's not a problem. So there's a kind of gaslighting denial that it's even happening, while at the same time not being necessarily trained as nurses or aged care technicians or home care people or carpenters, and needing to suddenly have all of these skills to help someone. So I think just being open about that we don't necessarily have all the answers, and trying to work together.
That's why this is so important, this research. Christine, can you add?
I would agree with that. I also think that there are resources out that, like, for example, Primary Health Tasmania has a pretty good grasp on the mental health services that are available in Tassie. And I don't want to say that we need to do an inventory of services under those different headings that Lindsey presented. But do we actually understand? I know, of course, TasCOSS does, in terms of the service providers, who they are, how we can get together. Maybe there's a role for TasCOSS with Anglicare in actually looking at that and bringing together service providers to actually delineate the services that each of them provide and look at the synergies and move forward from there. But that's sort of just what comes, it's without the duplication. I mean, my real concern is this ongoing fragmentation, duplication of services, because we're not actually seeing through that better health outcomes for individuals and for families and carers.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Christine. Maxine.
I would conclude by saying we've recognised that this whole issue is within the mental health space, and we have a whole lot of exciting reforms happening in mental health within Tasmania. Our organisation is funded through the Mental Health and Alcohol and Drug Directorate. I think it's important to go into the mental health space, look at how services are commissioned and funded, and start with there to go, what are you funded to do? With a tweak, you could do this, this and this. So I'm thinking, yes, let's go back and talk to funders, and then talk to services about what it is we already do and could be tweaked to include more of this. Education and training, I think, is a really big issue. So within the mental health space, there's a whole lot of amazing work and planning being done to increase service capacity in areas that we didn't have before, and this could be one of those areas that we could add in.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Maxine. Now I'm going to give the final word to Lindsey. And I think, Lindsey, you're also going to just talk a bit about how we can participate in Treasured Lives.
Yes. So, I mean, and sort of leading on from what you've asked, really. So we're doing a second half of Treasured Lives, which is focusing on the service response. So we are currently talking with the range of services, or would like to talk to a range of services in Tasmania about your challenges and your needs in supporting older Tasmanians to age well with hoarding, and challenges maintaining a healthy home. So, and between now and October, if you are providing services and would like to talk to me, I'd be more than happy for you to do so. The slides that will come out to you after this webinar will contain my details, so you can contact me. You can either be interviewed. There's an online survey that you could do as well, or a case study form if you'd like to work through a particular example. So we would like to understand more about, as you were talking about, the current landscape, what the strengths of that and the challenges, and I will also be looking at practice elsewhere. So when we can, the final report will contain what could be the next steps for Tasmania. So where is the gap filling, where are the new services needed, what do we need, what sort of practice framework look like, what would regional task forces look like. So I'd really love to hear from you if you would like to take part in that. I should also say we're trying to get the recommendations from this section sort of underway already. So we will stay in dialogue with Federal DOH around the changes to aged care post Royal Commission. There was a recommendation around support for hoarding in there, so we will hopefully continue conversations there, as well as you were saying, Maxine, with state DOH around mental health reform. So we'll keep these ones alive, but we will add to what that might look like by the end of the year. So yes, please do come forward to take part in the research if you'd like to. I would personally love to hear your stories and your perspectives on what Tasmania needs in this space.
Thanks, Lindsey. And I'd just really like to commend Lindsey and SARC really for shining a light on this critical and hidden issue. I think it's really important for us to be having this conversation, but also using this research as a spark for action. So not just sort of having it sitting on a shelf, but how can we do things better in the future and provide sort of more resources and support for this issue. I see that Lindsey's contact details are in the chat function. So as Lindsey said, please feel free to make contact with her. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I think it's been a really enlightening, interesting session. I've really enjoyed it. I just particularly want to thank Lindsey Fidler, who's the social researcher from SARC, but also Siobhan Marriott, Maxine Griffiths and Christine Materia. Thank you so much for joining the panel. I think it's been a great discussion. Thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.